Hey students, it's been a while since we've done a recording. I've been communicating through email and many of you have been connecting with me, so thank you. But I wanted to do a video because I think I want to go over the next assignment. So I did that with Beyond Me, I explained it. And I want to do that with the genre assignment, which is going to be your last assignment, last formal writing assignment for the semester. We have about 3 or 4 weeks left of the semester. And so it's coming in for a landing. So yeah, I think I sent out an email to all of you, kind of giving you an update, but I want to follow up with this with the recording. And so first of all, I want to thank all of you who have been staying on to task and getting your stories in on time and commenting on your workshop group story. All of that is very valuable. I know some of you have fallen behind or maybe you're behind an assignment or something, but we're communicating and you're going to catch up and get up to speed. So we have a couple weeks for you to do that. Um, but I also want to talk about the revision. So I've read the revisions. I'm grading Beyond Me right now. I'm going to finish that, and then I'm going to grade all of the second drafts of the object story. Um, but as you and then with both the Beyond Me and the genre, you would do at least one more revision, and I'll explain more about that. But I wanted to talk just briefly about revision. That it's important that it's not just fixing the typos, but you should definitely fix the typos, and it's not just making an adjustment here there. It's really an opportunity for you to look at your story and to make some change, right? I think when we write our first drafts, very often we hit a lot of the marks, but you could always look at it and figure out ways to improve it. So I want to emphasize that, particularly with the second draft of the personal stories that some, I encountered, not many, like, just a handful who hardly did any changes. So if you don't do a change for a required second draft, it's almost like you're not doing the assignment, right? So just be clear with that I'm looking for revisions. And I say it's not just the typos, but if I'm going through the effort of pointing out typos, you should make the effort of fixing them for the second draft. All of this is because you will all be able to submit stories to Escriba, which is a journal that is put out by the library here at Ostos. And many of my students in the past have submitted their stories and had their stories published in Escriba. So, but I'll talk about that in the next, which is the next and close to final video. So next or final video that I will do in the coming weeks. But I want to emphasize revision, how important it is, and also for you to comment on your classmates' work. Part of the idea of a workshop, otherwise we do one-on-ones, right? It'd just be like you write a story, I give you feedback, and that's it. And you're getting one opinion. Granted, it's a valuable opinion and it's an opinion that's giving you a grade, but that is not what the workshop experience is about. It's really about how these other voices also experience your work. And so what I have found sometimes when I read your comments is that sometimes with one particular story, like people ask the same questions. That's helpful because if everybody is not clear about something, that means there probably is something in the story that needs to be clarified. Vice versa, everybody's in unison, like, it's great, I love the character, I love, then you got to affirm and say, okay, great, I'm in a good path with this. So so both, it's important to not only write your own works, but it's important to respond to your workshop groups. um okay, so now we're in the final weeks, and for the final story you're going to be doing a genre story. Now, many of you have done genre stories throughout the semester, which is perfectly fine. The difference is that everybody here is not going to be required to do one. So I want to go over a little bit of a handout that that we're gonna that we're gonna use for the genre story. I want to say one more important thing before we pop into genre. That so the way the semester is working, you wrote a first draft of the pivotal moment story, and then you got workshop, you wrote a second draft, you got workshop, and that final draft goes in the portfolio. Same thing with objects. You wrote a first draft, we all read it, your group commented, you wrote a second draft, we read it again, we commented, and then that's after that second draft, the final draft goes in the portfolio. I'm switching it up a little bit for Beyond Me. So the draft that you already wrote is going to be your first draft. Then everyone's going to read it as they've done. People are commenting. You have until Tuesday night to comment on your Beyond Me people. And so do I, and I'm going to grade it all. And then you will have the student comments and my grade by Tuesday for Beyond Me. instead of writing a second draft, you're going to be able to just do your second draft for the portfolio, right? So you don't not required to write a second draft. If you want to write a second draft, you can, right? That will need to be done by May 2nd, but it's optional. And if you choose to write a second draft, then you will not only get a grade for it, but you also get 5 points of extra credit. So the second draft of Beyond Me is optional, right? That's new, that's different. And so you can just have done the first draft, got it done. I'll grade it. Your workshop members will review it, and then it'll be then the next draft you do will be in the portfolio, the final portfolio. Or if you decide I want to do another draft of this story because maybe the comments you got were useful and you want to do more with it and see what people think about it, or for whatever reasons, maybe the grade wasn't a grade that you were like, I want to try to do a second draft to try to get a high grade on this. Then you could do that as well, right? For that would be due May, and then that draft will be due May 2nd, the optional draft, okay? And then the last one will be the Beyond Me one, and I believe the date for that is May 9th. And then that will be your last that you submit. Then we have a week to read it and give you feedback. And then after that week, you can just focus on, if you haven't already fixed the final drafts of your first one, the pivotal moment, and the objects one. Well, I guess you're still waiting for my feedback for the second draft. Then you will have time to start working on all of that for your final portfolio, which the due date has also changed. So let me go over the new due dates. So the comments are due the 27th. All of this is in an email anyway. The 27th, the first draft of Beyond Me, that's this Tuesday. Then the second draft, if you choose to do Beyond Me, the second draft of that will be due on May 2nd. Also on May 2nd, you will have 2 reading assignments that are related to the genre fiction, and I'm going to go over those. That'll be due May 2nd. May 9th, the first draft of your genre story, the final assignment will be due on the 9th. Then on the 16th will be the day you have to comment on your group's genre story. That's when that first draft that you submit on the 9th, by the 16th, you'll get new groups, and that group, you'll have to comment those groups. And then on the 23rd, which is a new date, May 23rd, will be the day to submit the deadline for your final portfolio. And that's it. And so right now there are discussion folders open for the genre story, which is due on May 9th, and for the 2 readings that are due on May 2nd, right? So that is set on discussions. So let's talk a little bit about genre and the genre story. I'm going to share my screen, and so you'll be able to take a look at it. So bear with me one moment while I open it up. Let's focus. Let me hit share screen first. And share. So also, if you are looking at, so hopefully you'll be able to see the screen really big. And so what I've given you all is a genre fiction handout. And so basically giving you a definition. So genre fiction is actually the most popular kind of fiction. It is often very plot driven and has the intent of fitting into a specific literary genre, right? In order to appeal to a group of readers. So, and basically almost fans, these readers. And so genre is generically distinguished from literary fiction because of the plot driven, because it's very specific things in terms of plot driven and the other elements that are in literary fiction in terms of like symbolism and imagery and all those kinds of things on not necessarily the priorities, right? So it doesn't mean that it's dismissed. It doesn't mean that it's not there. It doesn't mean that these writers are not legit writers and they're like, it just means that they just make that distinction. So, but actually, if you look at the bestsellers list in the New York Times, a lot of those are genre books like detective and crime and action and all that kind of stuff. So let's speak a little bit about what genre fiction is. And so in the handout, I list a couple of them, right? So I have crime, right? So crime fiction stories are centered on the criminal enterprise, right? It can be told from the point of view of the perpetrators or those involved in its detection. So it could be told from the point of view of the criminals. Like the movie, if you've seen Scarface is definitely a crime film, and the star is actually the main drug dealer. And then there is, but you can also tell it from the detective, like somebody trying to discover a mystery, trying to solve the crime. Fantasy is in the realm of genre, right? And fantasy stories use magic or the supernatural as a primary plot element, theme, or setting. And fantasy is frequently divided into high fantasy, which is epic in scope and set in completely fictitious worlds, and low fantasy, which blends reality with limited elements of fantasy. We didn't talk about in this class, I mean, in the classroom, we may have read, we would have read a story on with that deals with magical realism as well. And so that's a different genre. That's like it's in this realm of fantasy. Fantasy is kind of like Lord of the Rings, right? When the whole entire worlds are created and they're big and epic in scope, and even like not in this terms of fantasy, but kind of in the realm of fantasy. There's like the Twilight series with all the vampires, where they create a world, but the vampire series will be more of low fantasy because there'll be elements of something fantastic that is interwoven into a real world, right? So these are real people, but the vampiric element is different, right? Um, so fantasy lends itself to lots of putting together of different measures, right? They say you can add different elements of other genres into fantasy, right? It lends itself, particularly this something called world building, like you're creating a world, right? So then there's horror, right? And some of us know horror stories, and the horror's goal is to frighten us or creep us out, disgust us as readers. Although many horror stories feature supernatural phenomena or monsters, it's not required. Like early horror took much inspiration from Romanticism, birthing Gothic horror. So if you read the original Dracula and Frankenstein's, there's something this the Gothic horror about that. And then there's all kinds of modern horror books that you can stories that you can write, which sometimes will fall into like the serial killer or elements like that might have the um, that scary element. So then we have mystery or detective, and mystery is interesting because they're considered like whodunits. And so a mystery could be something where usually you find out like something's been stolen. There's a crime that happens at the beginning, something's stolen, somebody's murdered, a child is missing, and the story is trying to either find the child, discover the murderer, or how did it happen, what was stolen, covering what was stolen, piecing back, almost going back with the plot and piecing together what happened before then. And then I've been talking about romance, fantasy and horror and gore and all that stuff. But then we also have romance, and romance is a genre. And so, like I said, a lot of these genre fiction, they have very specific definitions, right? So romance right now, I even now is still the largest and best-selling fiction genre in North America. It produced a wide array of subgenres, which majority feature mutual attraction, love of man and a woman as the main plot, and a happy ending. So most romances have happy endings, usually involve a man and a woman, usually involve that he wants her and he can't get her because maybe she's engaged to someone else, and or she's whatever, but um but definitely those are the things, and it's about making the reader swoon with the romantic couple, making them feel the emotions of being in love. And it could be an action romantic comedy, it could be I said romantic comedy, it could be fantasy, romantic fantasy, but the idea that a love story is the center of it and the driving plot force, whether they will be together at the end, right? Then there's science fiction, and is exactly what, if you think about it, right? Science fiction, although it's difficult to define, refers to the plausible futuristic stories ranging from rigorous hard science fiction to uh, social science fiction and space opera. So science fantasy occupies a middle ground between fantasy and science fiction. Usually, science fiction involves some element of science, of they try to create fact inside of it. Um, in sometimes in science fiction, I talked about in fantasy about magical realism, but magical realism could be inside of science fiction. So if you're hearing me starting to crisscross how I talk about the genres, it's because there's some crisscrossing that happens naturally in between dramas, in between genres. So the other two that I put here are Western. So that was like a specific type, so defined to be usually in the American West during the second half of the 19th century, and secondarily by featuring heroes who are rugged and individualistic and horsemen and cowboys, and but then also like westerns have subgenres like romantic westerns, and there's even horror westerns if you want to do that. But the western is really about the American West in a particular time period, like before many of the West was before the major cities began really sprouting up more in the West. And then there's inspirational fiction, which is a whole other genre that deals with faith-based themes, right? They call them, there's Christian fiction, there's like Muslim fiction, there's like fiction that, that are supposed to be inspirational, and stories about people who face something difficult and then have a religious experience, and then their life changes, and and their relationship with their God or their gods, or whatever their beliefs advances. So I apologize for the honking and the noise. I mean, I'm in an apartment. My new apartment faces the street, so before I was in the back and it was much more quiet. So I'm hoping somebody deals with their alarm. But in the handout, also, if you take a look, there is a link, and this link, since we're here, let's see what happens if I can click to the link and it'll take me there. So this is a site that kind of goes over some of the things I was talking about, but also gives you more options and more stories and more definitions and more subgenres within the genre that I've just discussed. So note, when delving into genre writing, keep several things in mind, right? When you're writing a genre story, I want you to think about these things. So most genres have readers who are very loyal to the genre, right? So if you're gonna write a werewolf story, just remember that people who love werewolf stories read them and understand the whole history of werewolf stories. So the same thing, if somebody considers themselves a science fiction reader, they're going to most likely be familiar with the conventions of the genre and have acquired knowledge from reading many books and stories. So when they pick up a book or story to read, they're bringing that knowledge into the experience that they're going to be reading with your stories. When you're writing genre, just keep that in mind. The other thing that genres have defining conventions. For example, if you're writing a vampire story, most readers are going to expect the vampire to need to drink human blood in order to live, to sleep in a coffin, to they can't be exposed to sunlight or they'll burn up. They cringe at the size of a crucifix, or they'll touch it and also get singed or burned by it, and they don't have a reflection. So things like that, right? So those are considered early the conventions of a vampire story. So the early writers in the genre established many of the conventions of the genre. So Bram Stoker's Dracula, which I mentioned before, laid out the conventions of the vampire story. So you can break from a genre convention as well. So the same way, say with vampires, they have to live in a coffin, drink blood, they can't see the reflection, they can't touch a cross. You could also flip it, right? You could say, I'm going to make a subvert the genre. So you can break from the genre's convention or subvert it. And we've experienced this with more contemporary writers, right? I'm rushing, so I'm going to try to slow down. So Anne Rice, who wrote Interview with the Vampire, she used many of the conventions of a vampire story, like, they have to drink blood. They don't have to drink human blood, they could drink animal blood, but human blood is the one that makes them strongest and the most vibrant, right? Um, and that they also, but then she subverts them, right? Um, and by having them, like some of her vampires wear crucifixes, right? In Twilight, it's this Twilight series that by Stephanie Meyer, her vampires need to drink blood but can walk around in the daylight. So sometimes just know that you're subverting the genre and you create the rationale for that subversion inside of your story, right? So the next thing you will need to do is I'm going to explain the two assignments that you need to do for next week. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. Um, and the two assignments that you're going to need to do is one is read in that genre packet that I was just going through with you, with just quick definitions. There are two stories. One is by very famous American writer named Mark Twain, and it's called A Ghost Story. And then you will have some questions to answer about some of the things I'm talking about, whether what he adheres to the tradition of a ghost story or how he subverts the ghost story, right? So you can take a look at it and a couple of other things. You need to read Mark Twain's story. And then in the discussion board, there is a folder for you to answer, I think, 3 or 4 questions on it, right? The second story is written by a writer who is not as famous as Mark Twain, but is very well known to all of you. It's by me, right? Charles Rice-Gonzalez. And that one's called A Haunted Romance. And so for that one, I gave you a little more since I wrote it. I give you a little more information on how I did it. And so I'm going to share my screen again and share with you a little bit here, but it's there for you to read and look over. So this is the ghost story. You know, it's just a couple pages. It's not a very long one. And then here are the questions at the end of it, right? And this is the second one. For the second one, I wrote an introduction to it, right? I wrote that some of these things in there. That I was asked to submit a story to this website. It was called Queer Romance. And then in that website, they invited 12 writers and they gave each of us a month. I was given October. So for my October one, I decided I would do something that was more Halloweeny, something that had that kind of feel for October. And so I decided to write a ghost story, and I decided to write a romance ghost story. So then what I started doing was looking at, what do I know about ghost stories? How do I organize, what do I know? What do people know about ghosts, right? That they used to be people that were alive, that they can walk the earth, that they can go pass through walls, they make noises, they can talk, some can touch you, right? Some people write those kinds of things. Um, so then I started doing research and reading short stories by ghost stories, and I was interested in them. And then I started looking at, since it was a romance website, I started thinking about, what are the romantic ghost stories were written. I discovered that 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 there was this whole genre of people who claimed to have had sex with ghosts, and I was fascinated. So I started reading those things, and then I started incorporating these elements into it. And then I also started doing some just research, like what are ghosts from a religious point of view, from a paranormal point of view, from a scientific point of view, and I was doing all this research as I was also thinking about the characters. And then the last piece that helped, that I want to share that helped shape it was I used to stay at this beach house, and in the beach house, the owner of the beach house said to me one time, they told us a ghost story, and they said that one time, one of them was in the bathroom, and they looked up at the mirror and they saw in the reflection someone in the bathroom and in the shower, and so they turned around to face them, and when they looked at them, what they saw was they thought it was a young blonde man, young, like in his late teens or early 20s. And the person said, because they're religious people, said, God loves you, go to the light. God loves you, go to the light. And then the image disappeared and faded. And then we said, what bathroom was it? Because the house had 3 bathrooms. And he said, Charles's bathroom, my bathroom. I have to say that I've stayed in that house alone since then. I've never encountered anything like that, but I stayed fascinated with the idea of who was this ghost. Um, so then, so I used that description of that ghost, they said, to craft my ghost. And I decided to set it in that beach house. And I used the setting to be the fall because, beach communities in the fall are desolate and quiet, and they're not like filled with people and partying and at the beach and hanging out. The beach is empty. There's something spooky about it. So I did all of those things. And what resulted was this story called Haunted Romance. I want to give you a little tip. I put this in the thing. I like the story. It got published in this website. The website no longer exists, but I have copies of it. Um, but I was so enamored with the ghost in the story that I said, let me write a short story about the ghost himself. Like, what was his life like when he was alive? That's separate. So I wrote that. So it started as a short story, and it evolved into a novel. So over the last 2 years, I originally wrote this story in 2015, and it was just supposed to be this little tiny story in a website. And then I started crafting this short story. And about in 2020, I did one draft of it, but at the beginning of 2020. And during the pandemic, I wrote a second draft of the novel. So this little tiny idea, this little story evolved into a whole novel, right? Or an element of it. So I share that with you because, even you're writing these short stories, and then if you are aspiring, I'm like, or you can keep them. Maybe years later, you might say, goodness, I wrote this story in that class back when I was in Ostos. Maybe I could develop it. So, so you'll be able to see that in that. But I'm just sharing here my screen so you can see what I did was I made this, what are the general characteristics and powers, right, of ghosts. Translucency, like you see through them. Insubstantiality, that they don't have any physical substance. the dropping temperature when they come into a room. People often say it gets cold. Repetition, ghosts seem compelled to repeat the same actions over and over again. That's a trope. I didn't know that. Imitation of life signs. Sometimes ghosts can do things or live as if they're living, right? But they're used to that. Sometimes some people say they have electromagnetic fields around ghosts. That ghosts have a particular electromagnetic energy, and then odors. That some ghosts, of course, spirits do not have the energy to manifest physically. Instead, they develop an ability to rearrange molecules in the local area to correspond to a structural discernible by olfactory glands, like you can smell them. So stop blaming the dog for a sudden gust of burrito. It may just be a friendly ghost hoping to communicate with you. These are things I did through research. And then I did this whole thing with some paranormal stuff. And what you're seeing is, what is life after death? And looking at this website, Spiritual Science Research Foundation, had all this research on what happens after death. And what I was struck by was these ideas of that the physical body, the human body, is consists of this flesh and bone, and that the other parts of it are the soul, right? The mental body or the mind, that the causal body or the intellect, like what you remember, like that your capacity to reason, and the supercausal body, the ego, right? So there's some emotional aspect. And they said that when we die, right, this group believes that the physical body goes, but what ends up happening is that after the physical death, this part, right? And all this stuff is defined here. I showed that I just organized it, but that this happens. So the body's gone, but that all these other elements transfer, right? So that's what I did, and then you'll see the story Haunted Romance that's there with the questions. So I'm gonna stop sharing. So I wanted to share that with you so you can begin writing your genre stories. They're not due for a couple weeks, but some of you are ahead of the game or on top of the game, and that way you can have the time to begin writing your genre story. And like I said, it's due May 9th. So it's not like a long time away, but it's like 2 weeks from today anyway. Today's Sunday that I'm doing the video. And so it's due on May 9th, which is in 2 weeks. So take a look at that. Take a look at the genre piece. I'm hoping you do. I mean, I've enjoyed many of the stories that all of you are writing. Your creativity is amazing, and totally encouraged by it. So yeah, so I wanted to share those things, set you up with your next and final assignment. There'll be probably like 2 more videos that I will do. One will be talking about the portfolio, and also I will send an email out about over meeting with people over the next 2 weeks that we can do one-on-one meetings and talk about your final portfolio, talk about anything you want. And you can also do a check-in. I mean, you should know if you're doing your work and you're writing your stories and you're submitting them, we got the schedule. It's pretty straightforward, right? A pivotal moment story and a draft, right? You did an original first draft and second draft. Same thing with the objects, first and second. Beyond Me is going to be a first draft, and then genre is going to be a first draft, right? And then all of those final drafts of all those go into a portfolio. So that composes most of your grade. The other parts of your grade are commenting on your assignments and whether you have done the reading assignments, right? And responded to the questions. But those are the elements that build your grade. So if you're staying on top of it and you're seeing what grades you're getting, you should be doing the math and understanding where you go. But if you want to have a meeting with me over the next couple of weeks, in the next, like by the end of next week, you would have gotten your Beyond Me grade. You would have gotten all your grades for your first 2 pieces. You would have gotten five. You've gotten grades on 5 pieces already, and the only grade that will be left would be your genre grade. So you should have a sense of where you're at. So if like in a week you want to meet with me and say, Professor, I don't know, it's all over the place. Can you like give me a summary? We can have a meeting and talk about a summary. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for your work this semester. It's not over, but it sounded to sound like it was over. But we have a couple more weeks, and at least 2 more videos that I'm going to do. And one will be on talking about how to put together your portfolio. And I'm going to do one as well, either I'll combine them on how to get published, right? So I'm going to give you a handout. I'm going to give you some information and for you to look to see if any of your stories you feel might be ready, or in the future, you'll have the information. And at some point in the future, you might decide you want to explore it, you'll have it. And that's it. All right. Well, I hope you enjoy the rest of whenever you watch this, day or evening or morning. and I'll be looking for you online to read your works. All right, take care.